over the last course sections, the learning curve got a bit steeper, and we had a look at more advanced yet crucial React concepts, especially, of course, when we had a look at React hooks like useEffect, useContext, and also useReducer. Therefore, before we dive deeper into React, this course section is there for you to practice what you learned together with me by building another course project, the Food Order app. Now, of course, we have demos in all course sections, but this is another slightly bigger application where all the key things you learned throughout the last course sections again come together and can be seen in the context of a bigger project. And of course, we're not just going to have a look at those concepts covered in the last section, but we will again see all core React features in action, including components, state, and much more. Now, this is the application we are going to build. It's a simple dummy food order app where we got a list of meals from which we can choose, and we can then add these meals to the cart, also change their amounts and also add them multiple times. And of course, we can also view the cart to see what's in the cart here. We can also change our cart from that page if we want to. And ultimately, we can, of course, also click order, though for the moment, that won't do anything. Instead, it will just add a little output here in the console, but we will of course also have a closer look at how we can store that in a database or do other things with that later in the course. But for the moment, this application is there to practice all those key features we had a look at over the last course sections. Now, if you feel like it, you can of course also try this on your own. Attached to this lecture, you find all the CSS files I plan to use throughout this section, and these file names also give you an idea of which components I plan to use, but this is totally optional. It is a nice practice, but it will also be a big challenge. Therefore, it might definitely be worth a try, but we can also simply walk through all of that together to again practice all these key concepts step by step together to make sure that after this course section, everything we learned up to this point is super clear. So let's get started building this project together now. For this, attached you find this basic starting project here, which is just again an empty React application pretty much. And you can download this attachment, extract it, place it anywhere on your system where you want to work on it, run npm install in the extracted folder to install all dependencies, and then npm start to bring up that development server. And if you do all of that, what you'll see on the screen is just something like this, because we're going to build this project together from the ground up. And that of course means that we'll build many components and that we'll practice many things which we learned early in the course already, because components and passing data between components and managing state and all of that of course are crucial core fundamentals of React, so we will need those in any project we build. But then, throughout this course section, we're also going to apply all these other hooks we had a look at, like useEffect. So that's the plan for this module. Now, to get started with this application here, we will need a bunch of components. And if you remember the finished app which I showed you before, if you have a look at that, there of course are quite a few components that can be identified, like that list of meals, or the header at the top, or the card, but also a couple of wrapper components like this general modal component, this overlay component, or this container our meals are in. We also got this image below the header, so there are quite a bit of components involved. Now to get started, here I will again add a components folder, of course, and in that components folder, I will add 4 subfolders, which is just a personal decision made by me, and I'll explain it along the way. One subfolder is the UI subfolder. I want to place general UI elements, general UI components in that folder. For example, I will have an input component in there where the user can enter the amount in this application. I will have a card component in there, which will be this container around my meals, for example. And I plan to place the modal component in that folder. So some general UI components which are not tied to a specific feature of this application, but which instead could be used in multiple places in any project. I will also add another folder side by side to the UI folder, and that will be the layout folder. Now in that folder, I plan to add my header component basically, and also another component which will be related to that header. Another folder which I will add side by side to layout and UI is the meals folder. That is the folder which will hold that list of meals, but also the individual meal item components. And then the last folder for the last set of components I plan to build is the card folder, which will hold all the card related components. So that is just the structure I came up with here. Of course, it's not the only correct structure. Of course, you can go for a different structure and store your components the way you want and write the components you want to write. This is just my suggestion because I think that this is a nice split to split our components between features, meals and cart, and also have some general UI components and some general layout components. Now, of course, we're going to populate these folders step by step throughout this module. I want to start with the header for now, so with this toolbar at the top. And therefore, in the layout folder here, I will add a header.js file. And that will hold my header code. The header will also need some styling, so side by side to header.js, I will add a header.module CSS file. .module because I will use the built-in CSS modules support which modern React projects created with Create React App, which this setup is in the end, provide. So this CSS file will be needed. And speaking of that file, you find this header.module CSS file attached to this lecture, and you can simply replace yours with it or simply copy in all the provided styles, which are some styles I came up with to give this header the look you saw in the preview at the beginning of this module. Of course, you can also write your own styles if you prefer that. Now in the header.js file, we want to have the JSX structure for our header. And therefore here I will export a header component function where we get some props. And of course we'll also, export this function to make it available outside of this file because I will use it in a different file. And inside of this component function, I don't need complex logic or state or anything like that. Instead there, I will just return the JSX code for this header. And here I actually want to have two blocks of code. One block of code will be the header itself, so that toolbar. The second part will be the image below the header. Though we could also split that into two separate components if we wanted to. Here I will keep it in one component, but again, that is definitely a split you could also make. Have two components instead of one. Now here I will use a React fragment, so that built-in fragment component, and therefore I want to import React from React so that I can access React fragment. Alternatively, we of course just import fragment and use that directly as a component like this. And I'm using this fragment component as a wrapper because we must only have one root element returned here. That's true for any place where you use JSX. You must only have one root element. And in there, I actually want to have two sibling elements. A header, using the built-in header component, and then a div, which will hold the image. And again, that would be the two components you could also separate into separate component files and functions. Here, I'll keep it in one component though. Now, inside of the header here, which is a default HTML5 element, I'll have a H1 element where I'll say React Meals, which is just the name of this application I came up with. Of course, you can choose any name you want. And then, side by side to that, I want to have a button which will open the cart later. So for the moment, I'll just add a button with the name of cart like this. I will change this code in a couple of seconds or minutes though. Before we change that button though, let's have a look at that div. And in that div, I want to have an image. So the built-in image element. And here I'm providing an image to you, which you find attached as well. And I will add an assets folder in the source directory, so next to components, where this image will actually be stored in. So attached you find that meals JPEG file, and I will just copy that into that assets folder. This is an image which is provided locally as part of the React application. Now, how can we use that image here in this JSX file? Well, we can use this image in a way which could look strange when you first see it, but which is very easy to use once you're used to it. You can simply import images, and it's a bit like importing CSS files. It's not really a JavaScript feature, but instead, imports like that, so importing CSS files or importing images, is supported by this project setup which we're using here. And behind the scenes, the import is simply transformed to include the image in the finished application, which we could deploy to a server, and to generate a link to that image, which is then dynamically inserted in the generated code. So there's a lot of behind the scenes magic going on here. For us, we simply import meals image, though this name is up to you, from going up, assets, meals JPEG. And here the file extension matters, just as for CSS files, because this tells that build process that this is not a JavaScript file, but in this case an image file, and that it therefore should be transformed and injected appropriately behind the scenes. And then we can use this imported image as a source here by binding the source dynamically with curly braces and pointing at meals image. This is how you can include a local image. Of course, if this would be an image on some server and you simply had a URL to that image, you could just add that URL to some image. To some image.jpg. You could add that if you had such a URL. But here, since it's a local image, part of the project, we instead use that other approach. Now we can also add an alt text, a table full of delicious food, something like this. And with that, I got the general structure for this header component finished. Though there are things missing. For example, the styling. Here on the header component, on the header element, I want to add a class name. And since we added this CSS file, which uses CSS modules, we import classes from that module.css file, so from header module.css. And here, as a class name for the header, we should point at classes.header. Because in that CSS file, if you have a look at it, there is a header CSS class defined. And as you learned in the styling section, this is how you use CSS modules then. Now on that div, which holds the image, I'll also add a class name. And here it's classes main image written like this. Since it's a CSS class with a dash inside of it, we can't use the dot notation. And that's simply another CSS class defined in there. Now with that, the general header structure is finished. With that, we can now go to app.js, to our root component, and there we can import header from /components layout header like this, And then instead of this h2 tag here, I will use my header. And actually, I also don't want that div here anymore. Instead, here for the moment, I will just use a fragment, which I of course need to import from React. The React import itself is missing here because, as you learned, you can omit that in modern React projects like this one. You can always add it as well, though. You can always also import React from React, and it won't hurt either. Technically, it's required because of what JSX is transformed to behind the scenes, but in some project setups like this one, you can simply omit it. And with that, if you saved it, you should have that header here. And this is a good start. This is now our toolbar. Of course, the cart button in the header doesn't look at all like the button you saw in the preview, though. And therefore, that's what we're going to work on next. So let's work on this button in the header. And we could add all the JSX code in here. I will create a separate component for this, though. Again, you could do the same for the image here, by the way, but I will leave the image in here actually, since that's not a lot of JSX code. But I will create a separate component for the header cart button. So header cart button.js is my file name here. And we could create that component in the header.js file as well, since we're only going to use it in that file. But I want to keep that file lean and not bloated. Therefore, I will follow this common convention of creating a separate file. We will also need some styling, and for this attached you find a header cart button.module.css file, which you can simply copy into your layout folder. And this includes some styles for this button. And then in the JS file for the header cart button, I will add my header cart button function, my component function, which receives props. And of course, also export it like this. And then let's work on the JSX code for the button. For this here, I want to return a button, of course. And inside of that button, I now want to have an icon, then some text, and then a little badge with the current number of items in the cart. Therefore, I will add 3 spans in there. The first one will wrap the icon, the second one the text, and the third one the badge. And when it comes to this icon, I also got a finished component for you, which you can use. And that's the cart icon.js file, which you could add to the layout folder, because that's where we use it, so this would make sense. But which you can also add to the cart folder, because of course it is an icon specifically for the cart. And whilst in this application, we will only use it in the header cart button, you could be using it in other parts of the app as well, and therefore you might want to store it in the feature folder, in the cart folder, instead of the layout folder. But that is totally up to you. Either way, this attached cart icon.js file simply holds an SVG icon and not much more. And you can use that to, well, render this cart icon. So therefore here, back in the header cart button.js file, I simply want to import cart icon from, going up one level, cart icon. So I import it as a regular component because it is a regular functional component. And then here, in this span, I will add cart icon like this as a self-closing component. So it's a regular React component, even though it holds SVG, because that is something you can do in React. You can use SVG code in your JSX code as well. Now, in the second span, I will have a text of your cart. And in the third span, I want to output the total amount of items in the cart. And for the moment, we don't have the logic for counting this yet. So therefore here, for the moment, I will just hard code it. Let's say 3 as a dummy value. Now we will need some styles. So therefore here, I will import classes from the header cart button module.css file. And then on the button itself, we can add a class which should be classes.button. Then on that span with the icon, I will add a class of classes.icon. And of course, these again, button, icon, and so on, these again are just predefined CSS classes in that CSS file. And for the badge, we therefore add classes.badge. If we do that, we can now use this header card button in the header.js file. Here, I want to replace this button with it, so therefore, I will simply import header card button from /header card button like this. And then here, simply add header card button. And now if you save everything, you should have a button that looks like this in your header. If it doesn't look like this, definitely download and compare my code snapshot because, well, this is all just JSX and CSS working together right now. So you should definitely have an output like this. The button, of course, doesn't do anything yet, but that is something we will add throughout this module. But for the moment, we therefore are done with that header. We added this header, it's finished now, and now we can work on the next parts of this application. So what's next? Of course, this is generally up to you, but here I want to continue with the meals, because of course that is a rather important part of this application. And for that, in the meals folder, I'll add a meals.js file. And this will be responsible for, in the end, rendering that meals list. Though actually not just the list of meals, but also this little summary text above it. And therefore, I will actually add two other components here, which split these responsibilities. I will add a meals summary.js file, which will render this text above the list of meals. And I'll render an available meals component, which will then be responsible for bringing the actual list of meals to the screen. Now let's maybe start with the meals summary component. For that, you attached find a CSS file, meals summary.module.css. And in the meals summary component file, in the JS file, as always, we just export a component. Now this will be a very simple component because it will just contain some hard-coded JSX code. It doesn't even need to accept the props parameter because we will not be using props here at any time. And here I just want to return a section, let's say, where we have a h2 tag where we say delicious food delivered to you. And then a couple of paragraph texts with some text below it. Now, to save you the extra typing, attached you find that meals summary.js file finished, and there you got these paragraphs already added, and you also got a class name added, and therefore here I need to add the import again. You already have that in the attached file, where I import meals summary.module.css like this, and then add this summary class here, like this. Now again, you find this finished meals summary.js file attached because it is a very simple file. More interesting, of course, is the available meals file. Here we can have the available meals function. We also don't need props here actually, because I won't receive any props here. Instead, here in this application, we will work with some dummy meals data, which is baked into this component. That's of course a bit unrealistic, but we will later in the course learn how we could fetch data from a database. At the moment, we don't know it yet, and therefore we will work with such dummy data. Speaking of that, attached you find the dummy meals.js file, and that includes a simple constant, which you should add in this file above the available meals component function, which is this dummy meals. constant, which holds an array of dummy meals. Again, that is that dummy data we're going to work with in this demo application. Now with that added here in the available meals component, we want to render this array of meals, which we of course could have fetched from some database or anything like that in reality. We want to render this as JSX. And therefore, we will need to transform this regular array of JavaScript objects to an array of JSX elements. And that is something you, of course, learned throughout the course. That is something you can do easily with React. So here we want to return some JSX code, let's say with a section inside of it. And then inside of this section, I want to have an unordered list. And inside of this unordered list, I want to have my meals list. And therefore, we can add curly braces and then refer to dummy meals and map them into an array of JSX elements. Now, we can do this here, and we did do this here in the JSX code in the past. But to keep this return statement lean, I will actually create a helper constant here, which I'll name meals list, which simply stores that mapped dummy meals list here, so that down there I just output meals list. That's exactly the same as if I would be doing it down there. It just ensures that this JSX snippet is a bit leaner. And it's totally up to you if you wanna do this transformation here and store it in a constant which you use down there, or if you do the transformation inline in your JSX block. Either way, we will simply map all these meals by passing a function to map, which is executed for every meal by JavaScript. And then for every meal, we want to return a JSX element which represents this meal item. And that should be some list item, of course. Though I can already say for the moment, we can simply output meal.name here, like this, but that's just temporary. We will soon create a separate component for the meal item. But for the moment, we can leave it like this and finish this first draft of the available meals component by adding some styling. Now for this, again, attached you find the available meals.module.css file with some predefined CSS code. And in the available meals.js file at the very top, you simply import classes from available meals.module.css. And then on this section, we can add a class name of classes.meals. And now with that, we can go back to the meals component, which should now group the meals summary and available meals together. So here, the meals component will again also be very simple. It won't need any props either. Here, we just want to import the two other components. So the meals summary from meals summary like this, and import available meals from available meals like this, and then return both side by side. And since I want to return two elements side by side, you know that this is not possible in JSX. We must only have one root JSX element, and therefore again I will use the fragment. So we should import fragment from React as a wrapper component around meals summary as a self-closing component and available meals as a self-closing component. And now with that, we can go to the app.js file, and here below the header, I will add a main HTML element, which is a default built-in HTML5 element. And inside of that main element, I will add my meals. So I will import meals from components, meals, importing the meals JavaScript file in the meals folder, and then simply render this here as a self-closing component. And if you save that, you should see something like this. Now the summary already looks good. Of course, the list of meals doesn't, but here we are also just getting started. Now, as a next step, I want to wrap this entire list here, this unordered list, into a card component. So into a container with rounded corners and a white background and so on. And every list item itself should also become a separate component, which also outputs more data and in a nicer way. Now that's what we're going to do in the next lecture. Of course, as always, feel free to not proceed right away, but try this on your own first. Even if it then looks different than what we're going to build in the next lecture, this is a great practice you can and you maybe should do before you proceed, and we do it together next. So as I mentioned, I now want to add a card component and then work on the meal items. Now I will start with the card. And for that, in the UI folder, I will add a card.js file. Attached, you also find a card.module.css file with some styling for that card. And this will be a super simple component. It will just be a wrapper component, which provides some HTML structure and some CSS code for any content you want. And therefore, this is a component which could be used in very different places throughout the application, which is why this is such a general UI component. It wants some props because we will need to access props children to get access to the wrapped content. And of course, we export it here. We will also need some styles, so we can import classes from card.module.css already. And now in here, I want to have a very simple markup. We'll just return a div here, which then wraps props children, so that whatever is passed between the opening and closing tag of the card component is in the end used inside of card. And on that div, we can then add a class of classes.card using that CSS class I defined here. And that's it already. With that back in the available meals component here, I want to use that card to wrap this unordered list. So here, we can import, and we should import card from going up one level, UI card, like that, to make that component available in this file. And with that imported, we can simply wrap our unordered list with card. And if we do that and save everything, this already looks much nicer. Now, of course, the meal items don't have the final look I want to have. And therefore, I will add a new component in the meals folder. But to make sure that we don't have too many components sitting side by side here, I will actually add a subfolder, meal item. Now, if you add a subfolder or not also comes down to your personal preferences. I'm doing it here, again, to group all the components that will be dealing with rendering a single meal item together. Because it turns out that I will actually build two components for rendering one meal item. And you will see which components these are in just a second. So in the meal item folder, which is in the meals folder, I will add a meal item JS file. And attached, of course, unsurprisingly, you find a meal item.module.css file with some styling. And then here we can create our meal item component, which receives some props. So our component function. And of course, export it. And now let's work on the markup for these meal items. For that, I will return a list item. That's the wrapper around every meal item, which semantically makes sense because all these meal items will be rendered in an unordered list. So having li elements makes a lot of sense. But inside of that li element, I then want to have two divs side by side. And in the first div, we'll have a h3 tag where I want to output the name of that meal. And I expect to get that name through props because we are rendering these meal items for all the meals in the dummy meals array. So therefore, here in the meal item component, I will now access props.name. Of course, on which prop you expect to get that name is up to you. You could also name this props.title or .n or whatever you want. It's your component, so it's up to you which props, which attributes, you could say, should later be set on that component. You just need to make sure that whatever names you're using here to access the data are the prop names you later use in available meals for passing down the data. So here I will go for props name, and I will reformat this. And below that h3 tag, I'll add a div where I want to output the description. And I'll therefore access a description prop here. Again, the prop names are up to you. And another div with the price. However here, I actually don't want to access props price like this, but instead I will add a little constant here before we return, which I'll name price. And this constant will simply format the price a little bit. For this, I'll use a template literal and output a $, and then use this special syntax with $, curly braces. So we got two $signs here, one simply to output the character $, and one in combination with the curly braces to inject dynamic content into this template literal. And the dynamic content I want to inject is props.price.toFixed2. And this will simply make sure that we always render 2 decimal places. And then it's this price constant, which I'll output here in this div. Simply to output this formatted price with 2 decimal places and a $sign in front of it. And then here in this second div, I want to render a simple form which allows users to enter the amount you want to use here, the amount of meals you want to add to the cart, and then the add to cart button. And that's this extra component which I'm going to add. A component which holds this form to not have all this form markup and logic in this component. So therefore here I will already add a meal item form.js file, and we'll work on that in a second as well. Before we do that though, let's work on the styling for the meal item. And therefore, since we already added the CSS file, I will import classes from mealitem.module.css. And now here on the list item, we can add a class name of classes.meal. On the div here for the description, I will add a class name of classes.description. And on the price, it's class name classes.price. And that's the meal item finished now. Now, before we work on the form, we can already use the meal item in the available meals component. There at the top, we just need to import meal item from /meal item to dive into that meal item folder, and then again meal item to access the meal item file in that folder. And then here, where we map our dummy meals, we now can map them to a meal item instead of a list item. So meal item like this as a self-closing component. And there we now should add a key. We should have added this before as well with the list item, but it was just temporary. But now we should definitely add it and access meal.id here, because every dummy meal has an ID. And I will also pass in the name prop, because in meal item, I am accessing the name. I'm also accessing description and price. And therefore, I will pass in the name with meal.name, the description with meal.description, and the price with meal.price. And I'll reformat this to make this easier to read. Now, if you preferred that, you could also pass in the overall meal instead of these separate props. And inside of meal item, you would then have to access props.meal.description and so on. I'm not doing this here, but this is an alternative you could definitely go for. But I will go for the separate props here. And with that saved, we should have something like this already. Now let's work on the form, which should appear here on the right, for adding them to the cart. So let's work on that meal item form now, which allows us to add items to the cart. For this, we already added the meal item form JS file here in the meal item folder, but of course it's empty right now. We will also need some styling, so again, attached you find a meal item.module.css file so that we don't have to write the styles manually here. Now in the meal item form.js file, we of course want to create our meal item form component function, and this will receive some props here. And we of course export this function here. Now we can also already import the style classes with import classes from meal item form.module.css and then start with the JSX markup for this component. Now here I want to render a form element, and in there we want to have an input like this, and we want to have a button. So therefore here we can add both. Now for this input, I will actually wrap that into a separate component so that we have a reusable input which we could use in other parts of an application as well. I'll do this as a second step though. As a first step, let's finish the button. For that, I'll simply say add on it, because that button will add it to the cart. Maybe add a plus in front of add as well. And of course, add a class on the overall form with class name and set this equal to classes.form, like this. Now we can go to the meal item JS file and import that meal item form component, meal item form, from meal item form like this, and output it here between the div. Now if we save this, we have something like this, which is not the final look, but which is a start. Now for the final look, as I said, I want to extract that input into a reusable pre-styled input component, which could be used in multiple parts of the application. Again, just as with the card and a lot of these examples here, not because this here would be a super huge application, but because these are realistic scenarios in bigger applications you might be working on. That you want to have these reusable, pre-styled utility components like inputs or maybe also buttons and so on, which you use in a lot of different places of your application. And therefore in the UI folder, I will add an input.js file, which will be responsible for rendering that input. And therefore attached, you also find the input.module.css file with styling for that input. Now in there, I will, of course, again, create my component function as we did it multiple times already. And of course, we'll import these classes, import classes from input.module.css. And then here, we can return the markup for this input. And in this case, I want to have a div here with a class name of classes.input for the styling. And then there, a label with some text for the input, and then the input itself. Now you could definitely write this in a lot of different ways, maybe even letting the user of this component decide whether you want an input or a select or a text area here. But to keep things simple here, we'll just always render an input. Now of course the label text should be configurable, and therefore the text output here is props.label. Though of course it's totally up to you which prop name you're expecting this name on. I will also set the HTML4 prop here to set the for attribute, like class. You don't set class or for, but in the case of class, it's class name in JSX. In the case of for, it's HTML4, because both class and for are reserved keywords in JavaScript. And here I will then point at props and then input.id. Again, this is my component, so I can decide which kind of props I expect and which structure these props should have. And I simply expect here that for this input component, when it's getting used, I get a label prop with the label text and an input prop, which then itself holds an object with configuration data for the input, like for example the ID, which we therefore then also add as the ID prop here on the input. So props.input.id. In addition, I will now use a nice little trick to pass all other configuration data I might have gotten for this input to this input element here as props. I add curly braces here, just like this, and then use the spread operator to spread props.input. This ensures that all the key value pairs in this input object, which we receive on props input, are added as props to input. So if input object here is an object that, for example, has type text, so if that is what we get on props input, for example, then this code here would make sure that type equals text is being added. This is how that works when you use the spread operator on an element like this. It's simply a convenient way of making this input highly configurable from outside this component through this input prop here. And of course, therefore, we can even get rid of this ID if we want to, and simply expect that this ID is part of this input prop as well, which we already do expect here, and then therefore also add it automatically through this syntax as a prop to this input element. Now, and with that added, we can of course go back to the meal item form component and there import input from going up, UI, input, and then replacing this input here with input as a self-closing tag. And there I will now add the label prop, because I'm expecting a label prop here with some text inside of it, with a label of amount. And then the input prop, which now itself should hold an object. So here the value is an object like this, hence the double curly braces. It's no special syntax. Instead, we have one pair of curly braces to evaluate a JavaScript expression, which is passed in as a value. And then that expression just happens to be a JavaScript object. Hence, we have that other pair of curly braces. And in that object, I want to have an ID, which is amount, let's say, type, which is number, and this is one of the built-in input element types. And I'll add some validation props as well, which are all props you can add by default to the input element. And that would be the min prop with 1 and the max prop with 5, to make sure that the amount that can be added has to be at least 1, but is not bigger than 5. I'll add the step prop, which is also supported on the input element, and set this to 1. And also provide a default value of 1, so that this is the initial value with which this input is populated. And again, these are all default props which you can add to any input element. So these are not props which we need to interpret and handle. Instead, we just distribute them onto the input through this syntax, and then they automatically start making sense because these are all built-in props for input elements. And if we now save that, this is what we got. And that looks, of course, very, very nice. Now, with that, we built a lot of components. And we still got the card component to build, but thereafter, we are finally ready to also start working on the logic of this application and to add context to manage the card, for example. But of course, building all these components That is the meat of basically any React application you are going to build. And therefore, I'm walking through that process again with you because you need to know how you can build components, how you can use components. That is super crucial and therefore an important practice. And with that, let's build that card modal, and thereafter, let's finally wire everything up and add more logic to this application. So let's work on the card. And therefore, of course, we can go to the card folder and add a card.js file for the card component. Now, the card component should render all the card items and, of course, display the total amount, and then also give us buttons for leaving the cart and for ordering. Though for this application, as shown in the preview, ordering won't really be a thing. Therefore, here we can add our card component function, expect props, and export it like this. And attached you find a card module.css file with some styling for this card. Hence, we can already import classes from card.module.css and then return the markup for the card. Now here, as I said, in this application, I want to render this card in a modal. Now we're going to build this modal in a second though. You can also try this on your own, also by using React portals, which is a feature we learned about. But before we are going to do it together, I want to finish the general card markup. So I'll have a div here, which will later be the modal component. And inside of that div, or inside of that modal then, I want to render my card items here. And then below that, a div with the total amount. And below that, a div with the actions for the card. So the close and the order button. Now for the card items, I again will add a little helper constant here, card items, where I want to map all card items to card item JSX elements. Now, at the moment, we of course have no card items here. So I will start with a dummy array, which I create inline here, which will hold a card item, let's say with an ID of C1, with a name of sushi, with an amount of 2 maybe, and the price of $12.99. And for the moment, that's it. And we then map this array of objects, which here is just an example. Later, we will get a real object managed through React context. But we will map that item here to a card item component, which we also don't have yet. So for the moment, I'll just output a list item where I output item.name. And then it's these card items which are rendered here. Card items. Like this. And actually, I want to wrap this in an unordered list. So I will overall set card items equal to an unordered list. Then an opening curly brace around this JavaScript expression. Closing curly brace. And then closing unordered list item. And I can also already add a class name on that unordered list and set this to classes card items written like this because of the dash. And that's the card items which are being output down there. Now, speaking of down there, in that first div here then, I want to have a span where I say total amount. And then below that, another span where the actual amount is being output. And for the moment, I'll just hardcode 35.62 here. But this is something which will, of course, be derived dynamically later. On that div, I will add a class name of classes.total. And then we got that other div with the buttons. This will receive a class name of classes.actions. And then in there, I want to have 2 buttons. The first button says close. And I will add a class name here of classes, and then it's button -- alt, and because of the dashes, again, I'm using this syntax of accessing that property. And then below that, I have another button where I say order, and this will receive a class name of classes.button. Now later, we will only render the order button when we have items in the cart, but since we're working with dummy data only at the moment, we don't need to worry about this right now. Okay, so that's the cart. Now, as I said, the cart should not be inside of that div though, but inside of a modal. So therefore, let's add such a modal wrapper, which renders this cart as an overlay next. Of course, try it on your own first if you want to, and thereafter we're going to do that together. So let's work on that modal. For that, in the UI folder, I'll add a modal.js file, and attached, unsurprisingly, you find the styling file for this modal, the modal module CSS file. And then here we have that modal, which will receive props. And of course, we export this component like this. And then here we can also import classes from /modal.module.css and then work on the markup for this modal. And here I will have a special markup, kind of, because I want to use React Portal for both my backdrop, so that thing behind the modal overlay which blocks interaction with the rest of the page, and I also want to render the modal overlay itself with React Portal to use that component wherever I want, but render the actual HTML elements in a specific place in the DOM tree. That is something you learned about earlier in the course, portals. And to render a portal, we first of all need to go to the public folder, and there the index.html file. And here we got this root div where the overall React application is being rendered. And above that root div, I will add another div with an ID of overlays. And that is the div where I want to portal my modal and the backdrop to. So that is a change we need to make to index.html. And with that back in the modal.js file, we can create the backdrop and the overlay and then use the portal. Now I will create two separate components for that, and since they are really closely tied to this modal component and both very lean, I will create them here in the same file, but if you go for separate files, that of course would also be fine. But I will add the backdrop component function here in this file, and then also the modal overlay component function. And both receive props because both will receive data. Now for the backdrop, we return a div with a class name of classes.backdrop using that backdrop CSS class, which is defined in the modal module CSS file. And for the overlay, I will return a div with a class name of classes.modal. And inside of that, I'll have another div with a class name of classes.content. I simply have these two divs for styling purposes. And then inside of that inner div, I'll output props children. So in the end, this will be the actual content passed between the modal opening and closing tags by the component where the modal is getting used. It won't work right now, but it will work in the future. So now we got these components. Now, here in the modal function, which is the main component which is being exported here, we now, of course, also need to return some markup. And there I want to have backdrop and overlay side by side. And for this, we'll need the fragment. So I'll import fragment from React and then simply return fragment. And in there now, backdrop and modal overlay. And this is how we could do it, or actually modal overlay like this to forward the content between the modal tags. But this is how we could do it if we would not be using the portal. Now, we technically don't have to use a portal, but to ensure that our HTML code is not all over the place in the final application, I will use portals here. And therefore, I will output two dynamic expressions here side by side. And I will call the createPortal method, which is built into React in both these expressions. For that, we need to import it, and it is actually imported, or it is available on the React DOM object from React-DOM. So not the React library itself, but the React DOM library, which of course also is by the React team though. And with this import added, therefore, we can access React DOM createPortal and create a portal for the backdrop and do the same down there. React DOM createPortal for the modal overlay. And here we need to pass props children between the opening and closing tags so that in the modal overlay that can be used. Now, createPortal needs a second argument though. It does not just need to know what to portal, but also where to portal it. And therefore we should select this div here with the ID overlays in our index.html file. Now, since we will need that in both createPortal calls, I will create a helper constant here, which I'll name portal element. Obviously, the name is up to you. And here we can access document get element by ID overlays to get access to that overlays div. And then it's this portal element, which I pass as a second argument to both createPortal calls. And that's now the finished code for that modal, at least for now. And with that code, we can go back to the cart component and there replace that wrapping div with modal. Like this. Obviously, for that, we need to import the modal component first, though. So import modal from going up one level, UI modal, not from the CSS file though, but from the JS file. And then we can use modal as our opening and closing tag. And to see this in action now, we need to use that cart component somewhere. And I will use it in the app.js file. So here I will now import cart from /components cart, and then the cart.js file like this. And then maybe above the header, the exact position doesn't matter too much since we use a modal with a portal anyways. But here I will then add cart. Not cart, but cart. Like this. And if we save this, we should have this cart modal here. Now, at the moment, it's always there, and we can't make it disappear. But that is something we're going to add next. Because, of course, it shouldn't always be there. It should be there when your cart button is clicked. And, of course, it should also be closable. And that is definitely also something you can try implementing on your own. But, of course, we're going to do it together in the next lecture. So how can we now ensure that the cart is only showing up when the Your Cart button is clicked and can be removed if we click on the backdrop or the close button? Well, we need to manage some state because we have different states now. One state where the cart is visible and one state where it's not visible. These are two states. And whenever you have more than one state, you need to manage that state with React. And in function components, as we have it here, we use useState for that. So we import useState from React in the app.js file. Why in this file? Because that is where we do render the cart. So that is where I want to manage the visibility of the cart. Of course, we could also do it in some parent component and pass down the state data through props, but the only parent component to the app component is index, and that's not even a component, that's just where we initially render it, and therefore we actually have no parent component. And even if we would have, it makes a lot of sense to manage it here. So inside of the app function, I will use destructuring to pull out the two elements I get back from calling useState. My initial state is false because that is my cart is shown state, and we also have a setCartIsShown function. And here we are just using useState as you learned it throughout this course, registering it with React so that React can manage this state for us for this component, and then getting access to the latest state snapshot whenever this component is re-evaluated, and getting access to this function, which allows us to update the state. And then here we can add a couple of functions to that functions. Functions which should be called when this button is clicked, for example, or when the backdrop is clicked. Because I'm talking about a showCardHandler function, which is a function defined here inside of the app function, in which I then call setCardIsShown and set this to true. And then I'll also add a hideCardHandler function like this, where I set cardIsShown to false. And now we just need to use that cardIsShown state and make sure that these two functions, which I just added, are getting called. Now let's start with using the cardIsShown state. In the end, we want to render the card component conditionally, and you learned how that works. You can simply wrap this in curly braces to evaluate a dynamic expression, and then access cardIsShown and use that shortcut with double ampersand operator to render card if this is truthy and not render it if this is falsy. And with that, the card disappears because initially it's false. Now showCardHandler should be called whenever this button is clicked. This button, however, is part of my header. So therefore, we should probably expect to get that function, that showCardHandler function, called from inside the header. And for the header, to call this function, we need to pass a pointer at the function down through props. That's also a pattern you learned about throughout this course. Now it's up to you how you name that prop, but the convention for these props which hold functions is to start with on, since these are kind of like custom events which trigger this function, if you look at it like this. And therefore here I'll name it onShowCard. Again, name is up to you. And I point at the showCardHandler. Important, don't execute it here, just point at it so that it can be executed from inside the header through that onShowCard prop. So inside that header component, we now want to execute that function, and we want to execute it whenever this header card button is being clicked. Now, this of course is another custom component, and therefore here, let's say we expect that we have an onClick prop. Again, this is up to you. I'm just using this name, which looks like the built-in onClick, because I in the end want to react to the button being clicked. But technically, you can use any name you want here, because you will have to write code inside of header card button to handle this prop anyways. But to this prop, I want to pass a pointer to that function I'm receiving on props onShowCard here. So in the header component, we receive the onShowCard prop, which points at showCardHandler. And now I'm forwarding that pointer at that function to the onClick prop on the header card button. And now in the header card button, we therefore need to handle that onClick prop, which we receive. Here on that built-in button, there is a built-in onClick prop. So here the name is not up to you. And I now want to point at props onClick, so that the function I receive on onClick in the header card button is forwarded to the onClick prop on the button. This can be confusing, but in the end, we're just passing down a pointer at this showCardHandler button to that header card button. Now, you learned that if you have a prop chain like this, where you pass a prop through multiple levels of components, could be replaced with context. And indeed, we could use context here for handling this card visibility state. I will not do it here though, because I think here it is okay to have these two levels of components through which I'm passing props. But you could implement context here as well if you wanted to. We are going to use context in this demo application as well, but not for this card button. Here I will instead go for this prop drilling, so for this chain of props. With that, however, if you save everything, if you click your card, it should open up. Now to make it closable, we want to make sure that both that close button as well as a click on the backdrop closes the card. So therefore, in app.js, where we use the card component, we should probably expect a onClose prop or something like this. As always, the name is up to you, to which we pass the hide card handler. And now it's inside of that card component where we need to handle this onClose prop. For one, I want to go to that close button and there add a onClick prop and point at props.onClose. OnClose because that's the name I just chose in the app.js file. It's the onClose prop on which we receive the hide card handler, and therefore it's this function which I now want to forward to the button, so that upon a click on the button, that hide card handler function is being called. Now that's one way of closing the modal. It should also be closed if the backdrop is clicked. And to make that happen, we should go to the modal component, and on the backdrop there, we should add a onClick prop to the div. So using that built-in onClick prop, which exists on basically all HTML elements. And there, forward the value we expect to get on whatever prop you want. So here, let's say I expect to get an onClose prop. Now here, when we use the backdrop, we need to set that onClose prop because we just added it inside of the backdrop. And here I expect to get another onClose prop, but now on the modal component itself. So again, here I'll be passing a value through multiple levels down to the backdrop. You could use context, but I also want to highlight that if you are using context and you always bind a click on the backdrop to closing the card, then you would make this backdrop very specific and you would not be able to use the modal for other kinds of content because clicking the backdrop would always close the card. So if you had other content in modals as well, then you would be too specific. So here, using multiple levels of props could even be better because in this case, it makes the modal more reusable and doesn't tie it to one specific use case. That's just a side note why here I think using props instead of context is good, even though we are passing data, or to be precise, a function through multiple levels of components in this case. And therefore now, in the card component, on modal, we can add the onClose prop as well and forward props onClose. And that's now the onClose prop for the card component, which is being set in the app component. And that is then this hide card handler function. With that, we can open the card, click on the backdrop to close it, or click on the close button to close it. So that's working. And with that, we implemented the card, at least with some dummy data here. It's not finished at all at the moment though. As a next step, I want to make sure that we can really add card items, and then we'll also refine the card overall, and so on. So let's now make sure that data can be added, or items can be added to the card. And for that, I want to use context. I want to manage the overall card data through context because we will need it in different places of the application. On the meal items, we need to update the card, and in the card component, we need to output it, of course. And we also will need to manage it in the future because inside of that card, later, the card items can also be added or removed again. So therefore, let's start by setting up that card context. And for this, I'll add a store folder side by side to the components and the assets folder. The name is up to you, but since we are going to store our application-wide state here, store is kind of a convention in React world as a name for this application-wide state management. And in there, I'll add a card-context.js file. The naming of this file is up to you though. In here, I will import React from React because we can then call React create context. And I will initialize this context with some default data, which will not actually be used, but which will give us better auto-completion later. And here we'll have an items array, since we are going to manage a couple of card items. We'll have a total amount, which is 0, let's say initially. And then we'll have two functions which allow us to update that context. And that's the add item function, which let's say receives the item that should be added. And it's the remove item function, which receives, let's say, an ID to identify the item which should be removed from the card. Like this. Now I'll store this in a card context constant, and I will export this card context here. So that's step number 1. Now we got this context generally created. But now we will also need to manage that context in some component with useState or useReducer, as you saw it earlier in this course, so that this context can also change over time and can update parts of the application over time. And we could do this in the same file here, but I will create a new file for this and name it cardProvider.js. Because in here, I want to add a card provider component, which receives props, and of course, which I export. And the goal of this component is simply to manage the card context data and provide that context to all components that want access to it. And for that here, I will import card context from /card-context, and then return JSX code, because this is a component, where I simply access card context.provider. And now we can simply pass props.children between card context provider. And this allows us to wrap any components that should get access to this context with this card provider component. And we can also add all the logic for managing the context data to this component, so that all about that is contained in one component and no other component needs to deal with that. Now for that, I will add a card context helper constant in this component function. And that is simply an object with items, total amount, so all the fields we set up for the context itself. This will be the concrete context value though, which will also be updated over time. And this also holds pointers for the add item function and for the remove item function. And we can already add these functions here and add a add item to card handler here, where we get the item and then do something with it in the future, and the remove item from card handler function, where we get the ID and do something with it in the future. And now it's simply pointers at these functions, which are stored as values for add item and remove item in this card context object. And it's now this card context object here, which is set as a value, or as a value for the value prop on the card context provider component here. And again, this will be dynamic soon. It's not right now, but it will be dynamic soon. And with that added, we can now use this card provider component to wrap all components that need access to the card. And in our application, that's actually all the components which are rendered in the app component. The cart, of course, needs access to render the cart items and also to edit them later. The header needs access to update this badge in the header button. This badge where we output the number of cart items. So the header also needs access to the cart. And the meals need access to the cart because there we want to add items to the cart. So therefore, we can replace this fragment here with cart provider as a wrapping component. And of course, we should now also import cart provider from the store folder and then the cart provider file. And we can remove the fragment import. Now we could manage that entire context also in the app.js file therefore, since we need it in all the components there. But by using a separate cart provider component, we keep the app component lean and don't have to put all the cart management logic in there. Simply imagine that you're working on a bigger application with different app-wide states. Let's say you have a product state and a cart state and a user state and anything like that. If you would manage all of that in the app component, it would become super large. So having dedicated store components which manage that makes a lot of sense. Now with that, we provide that context to all these components. Now we can leverage it. For example, in the header cart button, there we needed to update the appropriate amount of cart items in that batch. And hence what we can do is we can use the context in there. So therefore, definitely try using that context on your own. In the next lecture, we're going to do it together. So let's start using our context. For this, in this function component, we use the useContextReact hook from React, as you learned, and we use it here in the header cart button for a start. Now we will also need to import the context itself. So we need to import cart context, not the cart provider, but the cart context object from going up, store cart context. We don't need the provider component, but really the context itself. And then we can call useContext and pass this cart context to it. To get access to this cart context, which is managed by the closest provider, which is this cart provider used in the app component, inside of the header cart button. We simply can store this access, this object, this context object, in a cart CTX constant, but this name is up to you, of course. Now, by using useContext here, the header cart button component will be re-evaluated by React whenever the context changes. And it, of course, changes when we do update it in the cart provider component. So now we established this connection. And we can now use this to output our number of cart items. For this, we can add another constant here. Number of cart items sounds like a descriptive name. And here we want to get access to cart context dot items. And you could now think that you simply use the length of that array to get the number of cart items. This could work depending on how you write your cart logic, but I don't want to add every item as a new entry in that list. Instead, if we add, let's say, 3 pieces of sushi, I want to add 1 item to the cart items array, but set the amount for that item to 3. So then the length would be wrong because it's just 1 item in the cart items array, but there are actually 3 meals inside of it. Simply because inside of our cart items array, we'll have objects where for every kind of meal, we store the amount of meals of that type is part of the cart. So therefore, the proper way to derive that number of items is to access cart items, so cart context.items, but then use the reduce method on that. Reduce is a built-in method. In the end, it is a method which allows us to transform an array of data into a single value, into a single number in this case. For that, it takes two arguments. The first argument is a function, which will be called for you. The second argument is a starting value, and you'll see why it's a starting value in a second. Here we use 0. This function, which is passed in as a first argument, then receives two arguments itself, automatically by JavaScript, which is calling that function for every item in that array on which you're calling reduce. That's the current number, however you want to name it, and then the item at which it's currently having a look. And current number will be different for every item it's calling it. Item will also be different, but this is basically a number, a value, which is carried on across executions. Initially it's 0, but then after the first time this function has been executed, it will be the result which you returned in that previous execution. And here I want to return current number plus item.amount, because my cart items objects will have an amount field which stores the number of items per item type. And this will now reduce this array to a single number, and it's this number of cart items which will be output down there. Now if we save this, we see 0 here in our or on our cart button. Therefore, as a next step, let's make sure we can actually add cart items. For adding cart items, we need to go to the cart provider, because that's where we manage our cart data in the end. And here we get this add item to cart handler. Now, whenever this function is called, we get the item that should be added to the cart. And then I basically want to check if that item is already part of the cart. So if we, for example, already have sushi in the cart, and if that's the case, I want to update the existing item. If it's not the case, I want to add a new item. And of course, we want to manage this as state in this component, so that this component, and therefore the context, and therefore any components affected by that context, are re-evaluated whenever the cart data changes. So here we want to import useState or useReducer. Both are React hooks which allow us to manage state. And I will go for useReducer here because this will be a bit of a more complex state which we're managing here. Because we'll have to check whether a meal is already part of the cart or not. And for removing, we'll also have more complex logic. Hence, I will use useReducer for managing the state here. And therefore, as a next step, outside of this component function, I'll add my cart reducer function. Outside of the component function, because this reducer function won't need anything from that component. It won't need any surrounding data defined in this component. And it shouldn't be recreated all the time when the component is re-evaluated. Now you learned that in the reducer functions, you receive a state object and an action automatically by React. The action is dispatched by you later in your code, and the state is simply the last state snapshot of the state managed by the reducer. And then, as part of the reducer function, you have to return a new state snapshot. Now for this, I'll define another constant outside of the component function and outside of the reducer function, and that's my default cart state. Now that's simply an object where I say that I have no items, so an empty array, and a total amount of 0, therefore. And then it's this default cart state which I return here in cart reducer. Now with that, in cart provider, at the very top of this component function, we can call useReducer, this React hook which we're importing. And now as a first argument, we point at our reducer function here. We don't execute it, we just point at it. It will be executed by React for us then. And we set an initial state, and that's the default card state. So I'm reusing that constant here. Now you learned that useReducer returns an array with exactly 2 elements. Hence we can use array destructuring to pull these elements out of that array and store them in separate constants. The first array element is always your state snapshot. So I will name it card state here. The second element is this function which allows you to dispatch an action to the reducer. So I will name it dispatch card action. Both names are up to you because it's the position which matters here in array destructuring. Now the card state is now needed to construct this card context object. Instead of hard coding the empty array here, I will access card state.items, because we're now managing the items with state, and the total amount with card state.totalamount. Now we can start dispatching actions. And I want to start with adding items to the card. Here we can then dispatch a card action. And as I explained when I introduced the useReducer hook earlier in the course, it's totally up to you what an action is. It could just be a number or a text, but typically it's an object which has some property which allows you to identify that action inside of your reducer function. So that in that reducer function, you can run different pieces of code depending on which action type was dispatched. And I will use type as a property name for identifying the action, but it's totally up to you how you name this. You could also name it identifier or whatever you want. But I will go with type and then follow this convention of having a string all caps identifier. Again, it's also just a convention, but a very readable and common one, which is why I will stick to it. And then here we have, let's say, a type of add. It could also be add item or add card item or whatever you want, but I'll keep it simple and short and just use add. Now to add the item in the reducer function, I also want to forward the item as part of the action. So I will add a second property to this action object and name it item. This name is also up to you, and point at my item argument here, so that I'm forwarding the item, which I expect to get here on this function, to my reducer. And now we can go to the card reducer and start adding logic for adding a card item here. For this, I first of all want to add a if check and check if the action type is equal to add, because I only want to run this adding logic for this kind of action. At the moment, it is the only action type we have, but later we'll also have a remove action. If we want to, we can already dispatch this here, by the way. We can already add type remove here and forward the ID, let's say, like this in the remove item from card handler. Now we would have, theoretically at least, 2 kinds of actions which trigger this reducer, and therefore we want to check for which type of action it was triggered. And now in here, I want to update my card items. We could simply add our item as a new item in that array, but as I mentioned, I want to group items for the same meal together and manage the amount on a per meal basis. I also want to update the total amount, the total price, for all aggregated card items. Now let's start simply and simply add an item as a, item to the array though. And for this, we can simply create an array, maybe name it updated items, and set this equal to state items, so the items in the current state snapshot, which we get as a first argument in the reducer by React, and call concat. Concat is a built-in method in JavaScript which adds a new item to an array, but unlike push, it doesn't edit the existing array, but return a new array. And that's kind of important. You want to update your state in an immutable way, which simply means you don't want to edit your old state snapshot because of the reference value thing in JavaScript. That would mean that existing data in memory gets edited without React knowing about it. But instead, you want to generate a brand new state object, which you return. And concat gives us a brand new array instead of editing the old array in memory, which is better. And we want to concat this item, this action item to be precise, which we're getting. And I simply expect to have all the data I need on that action item. So the name, the amounts of items that should be added, the price. I expect to have all of that on the item which reaches this add item to cart handler. Currently, we're not taking care about this yet in the other parts of the application, but we will do so in the future. Now, with that, we got the updated items. I also want to get my new total amount, or my updated total amount. And that should simply be the old total amount on the old state snapshot plus, well, action.item.price times action.item.amount. So I expect to have an amount field on that item which we're getting and a price field. And of course, if we multiply these two, we know by how much our total amount needs to change. And with that, we can return our new state. At the moment, I'm not checking whether our item is already part of the array, by the way. That's something we'll add in the future. For the moment, I will simply return a new state snapshot where I set items equal to updated items and total amount equal to updated total amount. And now we got this basic cart reducer finished. Now we need to make sure as a next step that add item to cart handler is being called from some components in our application, like the meals component, where we have all these meal items and the meal item form, with the appropriate data. So with an amount field on every item, with a price field on every item, with a name field on every item, with an ID field on every item. That's what I want to work on next. So let's now make sure that this add item to cart handler is being called. And for that, we need to go to the place where we want to call add item on our context object. And that's in our meal item form in the end. There, we of course want to handle the form submission, so when this button is clicked. And when the form is submitted, we in the end want to, well, add that item to the cart, because that's what this form is there for. So as a first step in the meal item form component, we can add our submit handler function where we get the event object, which is sent as an argument automatically when we call this function upon a built-in event. And I want to call this function, or I want to have that function called for the onSubmit event, or the submit event on that form here. So here I point at the submit handler. Now you learned that here we should call event prevent default to make sure that that browser default of reloading the page is prevented. And then I want to extract the entered amount. Now I want to use refs for that. The alternative would be two-way binding by managing some state, but I want to use refs. Now the thing is that here I actually have a separate component, a custom component. Normally, we can use refs by importing useRef from React. And then we create a ref and we assign that with the ref property or with the ref prop to an element. Generally, we can do that here as well. I can call useRef and create my amount input ref like this. Now I would want to pass that to the ref prop, but since this is a custom component, the ref prop doesn't work, at least not out of the box. Instead, I also taught you how you can make refs work on custom components. I showed you how this works earlier in the course. All we have to do is go to the component where we wanna receive refs. In this case, that's the input component in the UI folder. And then make sure you import React in there from React and wrap your component function with React forward ref. So that component function is now an argument to forward ref. Then you get the ref, which can now be set through the ref prop on your component as a second parameter here. And you can now use it inside of your component function to forward that ref to that input here. So here I can now set the ref prop on the input element to my ref parameter. And that's this forwarded ref, which is the ref which is being set here on my input component. With that, we can now get access to the input through refs, and that allows me to read that entered value in my submit handler function. There we can get the entered amount by accessing amount input ref.current. It's always .current for refs created with useRef.value. Because amount input ref.current will point at the input element, which is stored in that ref in the end. And then every input element by default has a value property which holds the currently entered value. That value is always a string. Even if the input is of type number, it's always a string. So we can convert it to a number by adding the entered amount number, or however you want to name it, by simply adding a plus in front of entered amount. And this will convert the string number to a number. And then we can add a little if check for validation, where we check the entered amount as text, trim it to remove any white space, and check if that's maybe empty, so if no value was entered. Or if the entered amount as number is smaller than 1, or if the entered amount as number is greater than 5. That's a little validation I want to add here. And if either of these conditions is met, so if we make it into this if check, I want to return and not continue with this function execution of this submit handler. I also want to output an error message below my input and button, and therefore I'll manage some state here, which is of course optional, but which I want to do. I'll simply use state because it will be a quite simple state. It will simply control whether this form is valid or not. And I'll set this to true initially, and then extract my two values, the state snapshot and the state updating function. And I'll name it amount is valid and set amount is valid. And if we make it into this if check, we know that the entered input was not valid. So here I'll call set amount is valid and set it to false. And if this is false, then I want to output an error message. So here below the button, I'll output some content conditionally, and I will check if not amount is valid. And if that's the case, I will render a paragraph where I say, please enter a valid amount, 125. So that's just a little addition also to practice state and conditional rendering again. Most importantly, the form submission is now only completed or only fully handled if we have valid inputs. So if we make it past this if check. And here I then want to execute my context method to add a cart item, but I'll not do this in this component. Instead, here I will simply call a function which I expect to get on props, and I'll name it onAddToCart. And I forward my entered amount number. Because the cart item which I want to add needs more data than just the entered amount. In this meal item form though, we only have that amount. We don't have the ID or name or price of that item. That's why I'm not calling the context method here, but why I'm just calling some other function, which I expect to get through props, to pass the entered and validated amount number to that function. And now it's the meal item component where that function will be defined. Here I'll add a add to cart handler function where I get that validated amount as a parameter. And I pass a pointer to that function to the meal item form on that add to cart prop, which I'm executing in that form component. So here to that prop, I pass a pointer at this add to cart handler function. And now in the add to cart handler function, I want to reach out to my context. So therefore, in the meal item component, I also want to get access to my context. So here I will import use context from React and then simply call use context. And we now need to import the context to which we want to get access. So cart context from going up and going up again, store cart context, the file with a dash in the file name, and pass this to use context to establish a connection. And then here we have our cart context, and in add to cart handler, we can now call cart context add item, which is one of the methods defined in our context. Here, we're pointing at the add item to cart handler. And I'm calling that function here. And to that function, we now need to pass this item, right? That's what we're expecting here. We expect to get the item which we forward to the reducer. So it's that item which I want to pass to add item. And hence I create a new object on the fly with an ID, which I expect to get through props here. So props ID. With a name, which I get through props name, which we're already outputting down there. We don't need to pass on the description, but I do want to set an amount field, which points at the amount we're getting here. And I do want to add a price field, which points at props price. Not this formatted price, but the price as a number, which we get on props. So now we just need to make sure that we also get props ID, and therefore in the available meals component, where we render all the meal items, I will now also set a ID prop and forward meal ID. And with that, we should be triggering that context method whenever that form is submitted. And that should then add items to the cart. So if we save this, we reload, if I click add here, you see that batch number updated. And it updates whenever I click add. Now the cart logic isn't the final logic I want to have yet, but at least we can see that the context is already working now. Now let's make sure that here, when we open the cart, we are outputting the actual cart. So for outputting cart items, we of course need to go to the cart component. And there we again need to use context now. So we should import use context from React, and of course import the context object, cart context from going up to the store folder and then cart dash context. And in the cart component, we now call use context and pass cart context to it to get access to that cart context. Now here, we no longer want this dummy array of cart items. Instead, now here we can access cart ctx.items to transform these items to items in the cart. And before we continue working on the cart logic or anything like that, let's actually work on these cart items, that they have the correct look, and let's also make sure we output the total amount and so on. And I'll start with the total amount actually. For that here, I'll add a total amount constant, and I will simply access cart ctx.total amount. However, I will call toFixed2 here to make sure that we always have two decimal places. And I will put this into a template literal to output a $sign in front of this now dynamically injected and derived JavaScript expression. And that's now the total amount, which should be output here instead of this hard-coded value, like this. So that's now the real total amount for this cart. I now also want to make sure that this order button is only showing up if we have items in the cart. So for that, we can add another constant here, right below total amount maybe, which I'll name has items. And here I'll simply check if cart context items has a length greater than 0. So if there are items in the cart. And now we can use has items down there to check if has items is true and only render the button if that's the case. And with that already, if I reload, you see if I open the cart with no items, we have no order button and a total amount of 0. But if I start adding a couple of items, we see them here, we see the updated total amount, and we got an order button. Now, at the moment, items are still added incorrectly to the cart. We're going to work on that soon, but before we do that, I want to work on how these cart items are being displayed. Now for that, I prepared a component for you. Attached, you find a cart item zip file, which contains both a cart item JS file and a cart item module CSS file. Simply copy both files into that cart folder. That's simply a cart item component, which is not too fancy, which is why I'm just providing the finished component to you. In the end, this will just output the price, the amount, and then buttons for adding or removing more of that cart item. And in cart.js, we can now use that cart item. So here you can simply import cart item from that just added cart item file. And then render, instead of that list item here, a cart item. Whoops, cart item. Like this. And to cart item, we now need to pass a key, of course, since it's a list. And that can be or should be item.id. We also want to display the name, so that's item.name. We want to display the amount, which is item.amount. And pass the price, which is item.price. And then also pass functions for adding or removing items from the cart. So I will add these functions here now and add my cart item remove handler, where I get the ID of the to be removed item, and my cart item add handler, where I get the item itself. And we'll add the logic to these functions in a second. And now here on the cart item, which we output in the list, we should add an onRemove prop, because that's the name I'm expecting in that provided component. And to onRemove, we pass a pointer to cart item remove handler. And we add an onAdd prop, another prop I'm using in that provided cart item component, where we point at the cart item add handler. Now on both these functions, you should call bind and bind null item ID. This ensures that the ID of the to be added or removed item is passed here to remove handler. And on add, you should also call bind and bind null and pass the overall item. You learned that bind pre-configures a function for future execution and basically allows you to pre-configure the argument that function will receive when it's being executed. And that's something we need here to ensure that both these functions do receive the ID or the item respectively. Now with that, your cart should look something like this. And here I'm zoomed in, which is why it's a bit cut off. It should look something like this. Now, to make sure that this is never cut off, I'll also quickly go to the cart module CSS file. And here, I'll go to cart items and give this a max height of, let's say, 20 rem, and then add overflow scroll. By doing this, I make sure that this can't get too big, but that instead it becomes scrollable. But your card should now look like this. And of course, the problem we have here is not just that these buttons won't work, but that, for example, here we also have sushi 3 times, which is absolutely not what we want here. I also want to go to card item and quickly make sure that on the price here for props price in the card item component, I also call toFixed2 to force this to always have 2 decimal places, for example here for the schnitzel now. So now, as a next step, I want to make sure that the logic for adding items to the cart is different, and if we add sushi a second or third time, it's aggregated together into one item where this amount changes, instead of more items being added to this array. Now, to change the logic for adding card items, we need to head back to the card provider and there to the card reducer. At the moment, items are always added as new items in that array. Now that needs to change. When we're adding an item, I always want to calculate my updated total amount like this first. That is always correct, no matter if the item is already part of the cart or not. But then, before I derive my updated items, I instead want to check if an item is already part of the cart. And for this, I'll create an existing cart item index constant where I will reach out to my existing items in the cart and where I call findIndex, which is a built-in method in JavaScript which finds the index of an item in an array. Now it takes a function which should return true if that's the item we're looking for and false otherwise, because this function will be executed for every item in the array. And I want to return true if item ID is equal to action.item.id. So if the item we're currently looking at in that array has the same ID as the item we're adding with this action, which was dispatched. Now this will then return us the index of that item if it exists. So what we can do now is we can get the existing card item by reaching out to state items and accessing that existing card item index. And this will only work if we have that item already. Otherwise, we'll try to access an item which doesn't exist, and hence existing card item would be null. If the item already is part of the array though, this item will be set to that item. And now we can add an updated item variable and an updated items variable, which clashes with this constant, but we'll fix this soon. And then we add another if check here, where we check if existing card item is a thing, if this is truthy, which will only be the case if it's already part of the array. In this case, the updated item will be set equal to a new object where I copy the existing card item, but where I update the amount, because the amount now needs to change. If sushi was already part of the cart and we added 2 more sushis, then of course we need to update the amount of that existing sushi which is part of the cart. So here I then access existing cart item.amount plus action.item.amount. So the amount which was added by this action. And updated items is now equal to a new array where I copy the existing items so that I update this immutably without editing the old array in memory. Hence, I'm creating a new array where I copy the old objects. And then, for that existing card item index, I override this with the updated item. So I pick the old item, which we identified in the card items array, and I override it with this updated item. Now that's what I do if an item is already part of the card items array. Now we also have the else case that an item is added for the first time to that card items array. In that case, the updated item is simply a brand new item where I copy my action item. And now updated items is simply set to state items concat, and then here I add this updated item. Or we keep this simpler and we keep on adding action item. We don't set updated item here, and we move updated item in here therefore and create this on the fly as a constant, because now we only use updated item in that first part of the if block. And our else block is very lean now. With that, we set updated items to different things depending on whether the item is already part of the array or not. And either way, we then return our new state snapshot, which picks up these updated items. I hope this logic makes sense. And with that, if we now reload, I can add sushi. And if I add it multiple times, and if I add 4 sushi at once, you see we only have one entry here with the appropriate amount. And that's exactly what I want. Now, if I add a second item, this is added as a new entry, of course, because it's a different item. But then again, if I add more items of that, it just increases the counter. So that is working. Now let's make sure that the plus and minus buttons here in the cart also work. And for that, we also need to make sure that we can remove items. So let's now make the cart work, and let's make sure we can add and delete items from there as well. Now actually we can start with adding items because we got all the logic for that in place already. And in the cart.js file, we got the cart item handler, which is being triggered when this plus button for a cart item is clicked. So in the cart item handler, we now simply need to reach out to our cart context and call add item there and simply forward the item. And that will trigger that add item function in the cart provider. Here it is, which dispatches this cart action, and that will therefore already do the rest. So with that, if we save that, if we reload, if I add a couple of items, if I click the plus next to sushi, this already updates, and the same for the schnitzel. So this is working. Now what's of course not working is removing items. So therefore, let's work on this now. We already got the remove item from cart handler in the cart provider, where we dispatch an action, but currently we're not really handling that action. In the cart reducer, we should now add another if check, where we check if the action type is equal to remove. Like this. And actually we should do that not here, but next to the add if check. So here, right before we return our default cart state, which is our fallback in case we had some other action. Now in here, we now want to update the cart. And again, we'll have to make a differentiation here. Generally, we want to update the existing cart item. So for example here, if we already have sushi in the cart and we click minus, we want to decrease the amount by 1. But sushi will still be a cart item unless we had an amount of 1 here. Then, if I press minus again, if this was 1 here, I want to remove the item entirely from the cart. So we'll have to differentiate and check for that here in our reducer. We can start by finding the cart item as a first step though. For this, I'll again get my existing cart item index here by reaching out to state items find index. Same logic as before. And here, just as before, we can copy that entire code here and replace this actually. We now find the index of an existing item. Now we can also get the item itself by then reaching out to state items for that identified index here. We also want to update the amount, and we can do that first. The updated total amount is simply state item, state total amount minus simply existing item dot price, and I should move this past the existing item, of course. Because either way, if we remove the item entirely from the array, or if we just decrease the amount in the cart, we simply remove one item of that type. So the total amount definitely decreases by the price of one single removed item. So this line here is always correct. Now we can again create our updated items variable and then again differentiate. And simply check if for the existing item the amount is equal to 1, which means it's the last item of that type in the cart which we want to remove, in which case we want to remove the entire item from the array. Else, if it's bigger than 1, we want to keep the item in the array, we want to keep the item in the cart, but we want to decrease the amount. So let's start with the if case. Here, updated items is simply state items filter. Filter is a built-in method which returns a new array filtered by applying specific conditions. And we pass a function to filter which is executed for every item in the array. And that function receives the item. And if we return true here, we keep the item in the newly returned array. If we return false, we get rid of it. So here we want to keep all items, but we want to remove the item with that ID which we get on our action here. That's the item we want to get rid of. And by the way, here we should just check action ID, not action item ID, because for removing items, we are dispatching an object which just has the ID, not the entire item. So that's a little fix we should implement anyways. But now back to filter. Here we want to check if item ID is not equal to action.id. With this check, we make sure that all items where the ID is not equal to the action ID are kept, because this returns true and hence the items are kept. But the one item where the item ID is equal to the ID of the action, which is the to be removed ID, for that one item we return false here, and then we remove that item from the newly generated array. So that gives us a new array where this item with this ID is not part anymore. And that's the entire logic for this case that we had an amount of 1. Now, if the amount is greater than 1, we don't want to remove the item from the array. We just want to update the amount. So here we have the updated item, which is a copy of the existing item in a new object with the spread operator. And we just update the amount. We set the amount to existing item.amount minus 1 to decrease it by 1. And updated items is then a copy of state items to create a new array with the old items. But we override one of these items, the item for that index which we got here, where we then override the old item in the array with the updated item, which has the updated amount. And then here, after this if-else block, we simply return a new state object where items is updated items and the total amount is equal to the updated total amount. And that's our logic for removing items from the cart. Now we just need to wire up this button in the cart component. Here in the cart item remove handler, we now want to call cart context remove item and forward that ID. And if we do that and save everything, if I reload and I add a couple of items, I have one of all these items in there. If I now remove sushi, it's removed entirely from the array. If I add one to the schnitzel and I then remove that, the amount is just decreased, and only if I remove that again, it's removed from the cart. So now it looks like adding and removing to and from the cart is working correctly. And that's exactly, of course, what we want here. Now with that, we're almost done, but I want to play a little animation on the cart button now whenever a new item is added to highlight that this badge changed and that the cart overall changed. Now, as a final step in this application, I want to come back to this button in the header, to this header card button. Everything works in this application, but I want to play a little animation on this button whenever we add an item to the cart, or also when we remove an item. So whenever the amount of items in the cart changes. And for this, I already prepared something in the CSS file, which I provided to you earlier. I set up a little CSS animation here, which makes the button bump and change its scale. Now we just need to make sure that this class, which starts this animation, this CSS class, is added to the button. For this, here I'll add a little constant button classes, and I'll simply set this equal to a string using the template literal notation with backticks instead of single quotes. And here I will always add classes.button. But then conditionally, I want to add the animation class. Now to show you how it works, I will add it right away, not conditionally, but always for the moment. And that's the bump class. And now here for class name on the button, I set this equal to button classes. If you save that and reload, you see this bump animation here. It only plays once, but later it should play whenever this card changes. To make that happen, we can utilize useEffect. We haven't used it thus far in this application because we had no traditional side effect up to this point. No local storage access, nothing like this. Of course, you could add such features, but here we simply don't have it. Therefore, here I will utilize useEffect to play this animation. And therefore here in the header card button, I'll import useEffect and then call useEffect here in this component function. Now we pass our effect function to that and then our array of dependencies as you learned. Now here in this effect function, I want to do one simple thing in the end. I want to change my button classes to include the bump animation class, and then I want to set a timer which removes that class again so that when it's added again in the future, it again plays. So therefore, I will also import useState because we'll need to re-evaluate and re-render this component when that animation class is added conditionally. So here I'll call useState, set this to false initially, because this will control whether or not the button should be animated. And I'll name it button is highlighted and set button is highlighted. Of course, the state names are up to you. Here in useEffect, I'll then call set button is highlighted and set this to true. Then, as a next step, here for my button classes, I will not always add the bump class, but I'll check if button is highlighted is true. And if that's the case, classes.bump is added, otherwise an empty string is added. So no extra CSS class is added then. And I do this here because since I'm updating the state, the whole component will re-execute when that state changes. So this line will also change again and the updated classes will be picked up down there. Now, of course, I don't always wanna change this state though. I only wanna change it if my items changed and if the length is greater than 0. So if there is at least one item in the cart, let's say. Hence here I will check if cart CTX items length is equal to 0, in which case here I'll just return so that the rest of this effect function doesn't execute. Because this should only execute if we have at least one item in the cart, let's say. Now we need to add this as a dependency, but if I add cart context like this, this effect would rerun whenever anything about my cart context changes. And that's not what I want here. Therefore, I'll use object destructuring to pull out the items, to get them out of my cart, so that here I can just refer to items and pass items as a dependency. So that not the entire context, but only the items array is a dependency for this effect function. Of course, we can also pull this out a little bit earlier and, for example, also then refer to just items here. Now, if we save this, if I reload, if I click add, watch the button in the top right corner. It now bumps. But only the first time I add something. The reason for that is that then this class is added, but since it's currently never removed, thereafter it never changes, because the animation is actually only played when this class is added for the first time. Therefore, we should also remove the class after the animation finished. And I'll do that by setting a timer here. I'll set a timer which fires after 300 milliseconds, because that's the duration of this animation here. I played over 300 milliseconds, so after that duration, I trigger a function where I set button is highlighted back to false. And if that's false, this here will ensure that an empty string is added to the class's string instead of the bump class. So that will remove that CSS class from the rendered DOM. Now I also want to add a cleanup function where I clear that timer in case that component should be removed. This can't happen in this application, the button is always there, but it's still a good practice to clean up any timers or any other side effects that might be ongoing because you started them in useEffect. So here I'll return my cleanup function. You learned that if you return a function in useEffect, this will be called automatically as a cleanup function by React. And here I'll call clear timeout and clear that timer, so that when this effect reruns, we clear the timer. And actually, we do need this here, now that I think about it, because of course this timer can be set again before it expired. If we add multiple items rapidly after each other, we want to clear the old timer and make sure that a new timer is set and the old timer is, well, cleared. So we definitely should have that cleanup function here. And now we do. And with that, if we save this, if I reload, you see, whenever I add an item, this button bumps. And that's just a little visual tweak, and in addition, as a nice side effect, no pun intended, it's another practice and exercise of useEffect, which you need for handling side effects.